Well, you know, I've always wanted to be a substitute for Giles Randall, and, and this is a good opportunity. I farm about 20 miles northwest of here, and I am really pleased with the nature of this program and with the size of the turnout that we're having here today. And indeed want to compliment Warren Formo, the Minnesota Corn Research and Promotion Council, and the Soybean Research and Promotion Council for funding this effort. I think it's important that we get together and dialogue these important issues. I first became somewhat involved, or at least tangentially involved, with some of the issues that we're talking about in conjunction with what is called the Minnesota River Ag Team back in the 1990s. And that was an effort that was put together by the Department of Agriculture at the behest of the then legislature and then Governor Arne Carlson. And in part it is a response to an agreement that the state of Minnesota had entered into with the Federal Environmental Protection Agency to, quote, clean up the sediment load in Lake Pepin. Two things stand out to me very strongly in my recollection of that many meetings. One of them is that, depending on how you counted them, there were 10 to 12 different state and federal government agencies involved in these water issues, each with a somewhat different agenda. Now, different not in the sense of being antagonistic, but different in the sense of the primary function that they performed and the clientele groups to which it is necessary for them to respond. The other thing that stands out very strongly in my recollection of those many meetings was a set of people in part who said, enough talking, enough research, let's get on with doing something. And the danger of doing that, of course, is that A, we can misuse resources substantially, and B, not very effectively accomplish the objectives, with the result not only of failed objectives, but with another set of disappointment in what government has been possible and able to do. So I don't intend to speak very long, and I didn't come here to speak this long. My pleasure at the moment is to have the honor of introducing Dr. Stanley Trimble. You have the bio sketch in your handout and in your materials. I'm going to highlight some things very briefly because you don't know him in the same way that you know some of the other speakers who have been on the program and will be on the program. Dr. Trimble is a professor in the Department of Geography, University of California, Los Angeles, where he has been since the mid-1970s. His interests primarily are in the area of historical geography of the environment, and especially the human impacts on hydrology, including soil erosion, stream sedimentation, flow, and channel changes. His regional interests are focusing on the humid part of the United States and in Europe, so he has a worldwide perspective on the issues that we're talking about here. He has been a research hydrologist with the U.S. Geological Survey. He's been a visiting professor at the University of Chicago, Vienna, Oxford, University College London, and a number of other places. He has served in the National Resource Council Committee on Watershed Management and the Committee on Mississippi River and the Clean Water Act. The point of saying all that is by way of somewhat rounding out the background and the expertise that he brings to the podium in talking about sediment sources and sinks in changing landscapes. As you've heard again this morning, landscapes are dynamic, streams are dynamic, and it's important to understand the nature of that dynamic and how it differs from what is sometimes conceived to be a static situation in a static environment. So, my pleasure to introduce Dr. Stanley Trimble.
Thank you. Thank you, Willis. Ladies and gentlemen. But just by way of introduction, let me repeat this idea that I've spent much of my career relating human action to hydrologic changes, especially soil erosion. I have looked at two main regions in my career. The first of these was southern Piedmont, which was essentially finished, that work was essentially finished in the early 70s. It's published as a monograph for the Soil Conservation Society of America, so I'm putting in a shameless plug for that, recently republished. My present work, in that for the last 38 years actually, has been on the upper Mississippi River Valley Hill Country, the driftless area and the areas connected with that. I have three take-home messages today that might get lost in the presentation, so let me just up front tell you what those are. I know it's right after lunch, so this will permit you to go to sleep and wake up in about an hour if you wish. The first of these points is that we have had severe soil erosion in the historical past in the United States. No two ways about it, and you'll see some of that. The question is why, and there are many reasons. A lot of blame to go around. Farmers always got the blame for this, but the fact is that what we found was Western Europeans coming to the eastern United States and finding a climate that was much more, as someone called it, lusty than they had left. In other words, the size of the storms, the intensity of those storms was far greater than anything that they had known in the old country. In other words, they simply did not have the technology, the farming techniques to deal with these storms. And so for those early years, despite their very best efforts, in many cases, their very best efforts, they suffered, in many cases, tragic soil erosion. In other words, what I'm saying is they came from a marine West Coast climate to a continental climate that had much greater storms. The second take-home point is the significant, and I'm a scientist and I rarely use the word miraculous, but I would almost call this a miraculous decrease of erosion, a decrease of soil erosion since the 1930s. Now, interestingly, this decrease in soil erosion in the eastern United States is inversely correlated with climatic change. Now, we saw a wonderful presentation by Dr. Mark Seeley this morning on this increase in precipitation, storms, and so forth since about the 1930s. Our data are right on it. The early work here in the driftless area resulted in a USGS professional paper in 1982, professional paper 1234, that's easy to remember. And we showed a similar graph, and we showed that when the people settled here, they were having severe, or not severe, but heavier rains. Those decreased till about the 1930s, and then they have decreased or increased since that time. So what we find is an increase of precipitation, just as we're finding here in the present study area, Minnesota River. But despite that, we're finding an extremely significant decrease of erosion and consequent sedimentation, which is part of my interest. I will say, and I don't mean this in any patronizing way, but in my view, American farmers have done an extraordinary job in controlling soil erosion since the late 1930s, when at that time they were handed the tools essentially by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which had, and state departments of agriculture, which had been working on this problem since the early part of the 20th century through experimental plots and so forth. The third take-home message is that historical erosion has left massive amounts of sediment in many streams. We refer to this now as historical sediment or legacy sediment, but it is there and we have to deal with it. It has to be managed. We cannot, as so many people have done, infer that, that sediment yield from a stream correlates directly to what is going on the upland. It does not often. I would say sometimes more frequently not than it does. I will conclude my opening remarks by saying that this may not relate a lot to the present study, but perhaps it will give you a broader perspective, though, on soil erosion, particularly in the eastern United States during the period of historical settlement. Now, the screen here, on the screen, we are near Atlanta, Georgia. The year is 1979, and we are looking out across an ocean of trees. If you drive from eastern Texas, you come around in a nice, graceful curve around the southeastern United States and go all the way to New England, you are pretty much going to see this sea of forest. What people don't understand is that all of this used to be cropland. Why is it no longer cropland? Well, a lot of it underwent some severe erosion, as I suggested. I'll come back to that point in a moment. But the other reason, and the one we always have to remember, and the one that so many people forget, is because we can raise the food and fiber elsewhere with much greater efficiency. In other words, why grow corn in Georgia at 50 or maybe 100 bushels an acre when you can do it in Minnesota at 200 to 300 bushels an acre? And that's exactly what has happened. We are growing crops in the most efficient areas of the United States, and thus we have hundreds of thousands of acres that have been able to revert to forest as a result of that. That is something that gets lost in these discussions. Now, if you look at a place, we could pick almost any place there in the hilly part of the southeastern, particularly United States. Much of it looked like this back in the early 1900s. This picture was made in the early 1930s in Georgia. Very direct attempts were made by the U.S. government, largely through the old SCS, now NRCS, state, federal programs, let's say, and a lot of private initiative, and those areas were quickly transformed to something like this, and now we see them as something like this. The signs are still there, but they are now stable. They are now under forest or some conservative land use. But again, the legacy of sediment. Here we see a wooden mill dam, 12 feet high, built in 1865 in a stream in Georgia. Not only was it completely buried during the early 20th century, actually the sediment went to 4 feet above it. So there was 16 feet of sediment in this stream, completely burying the mill dam. So why do you see any of it? This photograph was made in 1968 or 69. Because conservation, first of all, the land reverted from crops to forest. And secondly, because of the soil conservation measures that were put on the land to which I referred just a moment ago. You take the load away from a stream, guess what? It's going to carry it away if it possibly can. If it's mobile, the stream will pick it up and carry it away. And that is exactly what is happening. There is the movement, the transiency of this sediment moving out. It's a perfectly natural process. But people have to understand that such sediment is in the stream system that is going to continue to be transported and will have to be managed. It does not necessarily directly relate to what is occurring on the upland. So that movement of sand, here we see nicely washed granitic sand. Wouldn't you like to have that for your sand pile? Moving down, covering a floodplain in Georgia. Further aggrading streams as it moves downstream, raising the stream level. The adjacent floodplain often is then flooded, turned into a wetland or even a lake. The lake you see in the background was a cornfield as late as 1917. The photograph was made in 1969. So we can encapsulate all of this in a set of diagrams. At the upper shows this would be the upper part of the basin. This would be further downstream. At the time of settlement, people largely settling on the bottomlands, which were the best lands there in the southern Piedmont. Then the period of high soil erosion, when erosion, gullying, and so forth was occurring from the uplands, transported down into the valleys. There, most of it was deposited and still lurks, and is then subject to further transport, and we see that occurring in the third block. We see the uplands now back in conservation land uses here or in forest. Very little erosion. The stream now has the tractive force to carry this material out. Very little load from the uplands and is doing so. So we see the transfer out of this upper basin into the lower basin. Now that's kind of basics of what we're going to be talking about today, because we're going to be looking at it in a more complex system in the upper Midwest. Now look, before we leave this, let me point out one more time that what we were seeing there was land reversion. In other words, there's very little agriculture there now, as we just talked about. There's no need for it. The land is not productive enough. It's simply not economic under present economic conditions to farm it. So it isn't. It's in forest. Land reversion. Well, great. It's a great story. But what about those areas of the United States where agriculture is still active, where it was active in the 1920s, the 1930s, and it really never abated? Well, where do you find that? The upper Midwest, of course. And so what we have here is the upper Mississippi River Hill Country. Extends all the way from Red Wing down past Dubuque. You can see it's the size of a small state. I have two basins of great interest here, Coon Creek, south of La Crosse, in the Whitewater River Valley, which of course you know. And there are a lot of other small basins. Now, why are those of interest? Because they were studied extensively back in the 1930s by the US government. I was fortunate enough, my first job was at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. I was fortunate enough to fall heir to this, and I have carried on this work since 1973. Just to give you some idea of research plan, this is the one for Coon Creek. And you can see Coon Creek is a basin of about 120 square miles, about 30 miles long. It flows directly into the Mississippi River at Stoddard, Wisconsin. What they did was to go in, and let me just say that in the reconnaissance by the USDA back in the 1930s, they found that this upper Mississippi River Valley, the quote driftless area, although it extends beyond that, was one of the severe erosion problems in the United States. And they were sent to study it. And one of their, again, test basins, if you will, intensive study basins was Coon Creek. Well, what did they do? Well, they found that the bottomlands had been buried by sediment, as I just suggested. So they just took this thing on head on. They did profiles at about 1 mile interval across valleys. They did borings down to the old dark soil like you have here. That's what the bottoms look like there. They were prairie soils, molly salts. And then they surveyed. And the idea is that they did all this work, and it was an incredible project with very good people. They were going to come back and study it in a few years. Well, World War II came along, and it sort of got lost. And so I was lucky enough to pick up the project in the 1930s. And the point being here, that we're not talking about equations, we're not talking about models, we're talking about hard, measured data on the ground. Here's the bottom line. We look at the sediment budgets from 1853 to 1993. We could spend all day on this, we're not. You can see that the thickness of these lines is suggestive of the flow of sediment. And we can see up here the sources at the top, the sinks at the bottom. It's really complex. That's the first thing I want you to see. The second thing I want you to see is how little of this is getting out to the Mississippi River. Very little. And that changes very little over time. And it's changed very little since then, even despite that 500, 1,000 year, or 2 or 3 of these events in recent times. Oh yes, we've had some big events which were supposed to rupture the system. They didn't, it held, but back to that in a moment. So that's the takeaway from this diagram, other than say that it's 30 years of work for me personally, plus the additional work that went into it. Let's bring this back to a much more human scale. We are looking at a photograph of Chaseburg, Wisconsin. This photograph is made in about 1905. Chaseburg was built on an island. Coon Creek flows around it. And you can see it's a prosperous little village built largely on the island itself. You can see all sorts of buildings. There's a mill over here. There's a village hotel here. But I want to bring your attention to this small house built in 1903, right on the bank of the stream on a low terrace. And we'll look close up here. Again, here's the house and an outhouse behind it. Here's the stream flowing beside it. That's 1903. This is 1977. Some people from the Department of Agriculture are here with me. Where is the house? Well, the house is gone, but the foundation is in the hole. There is the foundation of the house. We're excavating it. Very good. It's a very good exercise because it keeps graduate students out of the beer joints, you see. I'm kidding. Actually, I wound up doing most of the digging. And there is the basis of the foundation. So the bottom of the foundation is here, and to the right I have flagged the contact between the old mollisol and the modern sediment above it. All that sediment you see above was deposited after 1853, mostly after the 1900. Indeed, the person who built this house beside the stream, I mean, his family had been there 50 years. They had been observing the stream for 50 years, and he built his house beside the stream. What does that tell you? Well, I mean, you know, country people have smarts, and they had been observing the stream. Low terrace, he knew, was not going to flood, and they built the house there. Unfortunately, the landscape was coming apart, and we'll see based on the past 50 to 60 years of land use, and we'll see how that works out. He couldn't really have known this. This is I'm sorry I don't have an earlier shot of the old wooden mill dam, but this is a later mill dam that was put in. It was built in 1934. This is pictures made in 1946, just as it's about to be buried. They've already blown it with dynamite on the right. The turbine wheel is in a pit to the left, but I want you to notice the concrete stanchion here, which was built to hold flashboards so they could raise the level of the mill. That's 1946. That's 1977. There is no sign of the mill, nothing, all gone. So again, 6 o'clock in the afternoon, the graduate students are agitating. Wait a minute, I got a little project here. And there is the concrete stanchion buried. Now, this was for more than just to keep them under control. The reason for it is because there had been an elevation placed on that dam in the 1940s, which was related back to earlier surveys in town. So once we took a backside off of that dam, we knew water elevation, everything in this village back to about 1903. So we were able to archaeologically reconstruct the village from that time, and here's what it looked like in 1977. Here is the foundation of the house you just saw. Here was the village hotel. You can see the basement was still there. This terrace on which it sat was covered with about 2 to 3 feet of sediment. Here was a village street covered with about 3 feet of sediment. And over here was the mill dam. There's the stanchion you just saw, the turbine box, all of that buried. The stream flowed on bedrock as late as 1914. What does that tell us? It tells us that there was a lot of sediment and it came in very fast. How would you like to wake up one morning and find your car in this situation? Now, normally, when I showed this in the Midwest, I got a gasp. So the audience failed today. You flunked. I showed this in California. They don't bat an eye. I mean, so used to seeing this. But this is in Peterson, Minnesota, not far from here, or was. That was one morning bright and early in 1938. They woke up and their car was buried. Why? Because the Pleistocene terrace right behind them had gullied during the night. Apparently it was already started, but they had a cloud burst, and you see what they got. Here's a broader picture that puts the whole thing in context. There's the Methodist Church in Peterson in the background. See what I mean? The landscape was out of control. All right, we're back in Coon Creek now. Now, these anecdotal things are great, but what we need here are hard data. And for the first time ever, and I say that advice, the first time ever, I was essentially given the baseline data to make measurements of the sediment budget, which had never been done before. And I want to acknowledge the fact that this was a gift to me. So we're looking now at a bridge crossing. New bridge built in 1934 to replace an old crossing from which had existed up to new bridge 1930, replacing a bridge built, I'll get it right in a minute. Bridge built in 1930 to replace the old crossing right here, which you can see. This photograph was made in 1934. Only 4 years have elapsed. The road here is completely buried. You see no trace of that old road coming across and crossing the stream. No evidence of the bridge, nothing. All obliterated in 4 years. What this indicates is how rapidly the floodplain is aggrading. Indeed, it was aggrading at an average of 6 inches per year back in the 1930s. This is an indication then of the erosion rates that are occurring. What we're looking at right here is an old railroad grade, and all of these together allowed us then to do a lot of digging and a lot of boring and put together a history of the accretion here. So we had, at the bottom, we had the original soil profile. Coming up, we had a 1904 profile based on the railroad embankment. We had a survey in 1938, and we are there in this is 1977, and we are presently surveying. If you're looking right here, you'll see some red flags. They are flagging our borings to the old road. This was the bridge crossing here. No sign of any of that. Now you say, well, okay, and what did we get for this? Well, that's what we got. In other words, that indicates the magnitudes. We went from practically no erosion at the time of European settlement. How do we know that, by the way? We know that from explorers' accounts. We know that from the fact that the floodplain soils were very uniform, high carbon. In other words, there was very little going on to either cover them with accretion or lateral migration of the stream. Also, streams are full of brook trout. Brook trouts do not like sediment. It clearly was a low erosion environment originally. Going up to peaks, we need not talk about the numbers here, but I think you can see the change in magnitude. That's the bad news. The good news is what has happened since the 1920s and 30s, coming down to a level here, and our more recent studies suggest that it is about correct. In other words, this accretion rate is only about 6% of what it was presently, 6% or less of what it was in the 1920s and 30s. That is from soil conservation, right up front. Let me say it. Soil conservation. So in implemented soil conservation practices. Climate, again, let me repeat, has worked against us. Precip, big events have increased over that period of time. So, when people say, well, it's a climate thing. No, it isn't. No, it isn't. We've had to work against climate, and yet despite it, see what we've done. Well, let me give you some more evidence. That's a little hard to believe. You say, based on a sample of one, you can prove anything. Okay, fair enough. So there's 6 of them. We did 6 reconstructions. A lot of digging, a lot of boring, a lot of surveying, a lot of historical research. But there you got 6 places, and we got similar records in all of these. And that's what was bequeathed to us. I had to follow up on it. But we decided to follow another route, and that was small reservoirs. So what we're doing here is surveying a PO 566 reservoir, of which I think there were 12 built in 1963 in this basin. And we are looking at the sediment accumulation over that period of time, during that period. And then for the older period, which was a bad time, this is just north of Winona on Highway 71, State Highway 74. Federal Highway. No, that's the Whitewater. But anyway, it's the federal highway along the river. And people are just driving, minding their own business during a rainstorm in 1938, and this happens to them. The fan comes from an adjacent gully and buries their car. This happened many, many times in this region. And as a result of that, highway departments, all kinds of agencies came in and built structures to try to control that. And here is one of these structures built in Wisconsin to control deposition on Highway 56. This is in Vernon County. Now, this was built, you can see the dam, and that reservoir filled in 2 years. Built in 1940, by 1942, it was completely full. So my crew is here in 1977, 76 or 77, somewhere in that period, and we're surveying it to find out how much was deposited in that 2 years. And while we're at it, let's just go up and have a look at the gully that created this, or that filled it in 2 years. So we're in the gully. You get the picture? It's stable. Further up, it's stable. And we get to the top. We ask the question, why is it stable? Well, we're standing on part of it. We're standing on a field of alfalfa. Alfalfa is hydrologic dynamite. I mean, it can send roots down 100 feet, stays there for a long period of time. It permits great infiltration capacities for the soil. But there's more than that. Look down the slope. You'll see a row of sumac on the steeper slopes. You see the farmers moving out of there. And if you look even further than that, you'll see a row of popple trees. They're all pioneers. They've all moved in. In other words, that was cultivated back in the 30s. So why did the farmer move out? Was it altruism? No. It's modern farm equipment. You know, modern farm equipment is always getting blamed for something, but here we see an example of people moving from horses to equipment, to mechanized equipment, and moving out of these steep slopes. So those steep slopes now are reverting to forest. But what he's still cultivating is at this point, a rotation of alfalfa. So folks, that's why the gully was dormant in 1977. And there's always somebody lurking back there. Yeah, but when the big storm comes, it'll break open. All right, so the big storm came. 18 August 2007, 15 inches in 24 hours. We went back to this area. That reservoir had about, I'd say, an average of an inch or two of material deposited on it. 500. Mark Seeley said it was a 1,000-year storm, whatever. It was a big storm, and it did not break open. And by the way, I might add, it did not break open the minimum till fields too, or no-till fields. Okay, now what brought all of this about? We are looking at a typical landscape in that region in February of 1934. First of all, you'll see the fields are pretty much oriented to the land survey system, that is to say rectilinear. That's the first thing you will see. The second thing you will see, because of the snow highlighting them, are hundreds of rills and gullies across that landscape. That is not untypical at all. If water can infiltrate, it's going to move across the surface. It did. Both is, well, I'm not sure I believe in sheet flow, but rills and gullies, and carried material off that landscape. What you see there is an indicator of the hydrologic response at that time, given that land management. So 1934. Now remember, at that time, there's a huge movement occurring of new techniques, which the Department of Agriculture, state agencies are preparing now to bring to the farmers. And so we look at that same landscape in 1967, only 33 years later, same landscape. Let me just go back. Look at the road, if you don't believe it. See the curving road? 1934, 1967. All right, you do not see any rills, gullies, anything moving across those contour strips. And what you do not see in this photograph are the many soil conservation measures that are being implemented. Now understand that these conservation measures are those developed in the 1930s and 40s. We're talking about strip farming, better rotations, etc. We're not talking at this point about no-till. That's on the horizon. And if we see an order of magnitude or more improvement with this, in my view, no minimum till, no and minimum till give us yet another order of magnitude in improvement. That is to say, protection against soil erosion. Why did it happen? Well, if we reconstruct land use for that area, we see a very minor change of land use. In other words, there's been a small decrease in cultivated area over that period of time, but not a great one. So what's the change? Well, the change has been in conservation measures. I didn't bring all those with me. If you're interested in seeing what those are and what the numbers are, I'll refer you to professional paper 1234. It's pretty complex. You can see what the rotations are, what measures, you know what, I think you have a general idea of what they are, but we have the numbers there. So how did all this play out? How does land use relate then to soil erosion and then to the movement of sediment in a watershed, at least the accumulation in the valley? So what we have here now is a relationship between erosive land use. Here's the driver. And what I've used for that is just the first two factors of the universal soil loss equation, well, not the first two, but two of them, the last two, the cropping factor and the practices factor. And so I've weighted those, and those then are across the bottom, the abscissa. And then on the ordinate, we have tons per square mile in thousands. In other words, you can think of it here. Here is the input of land use. Here is the output of what we in geomorphology would call geomorphic work. What's accomplished by it? And so we saw these farmers coming in, and we saw them putting pressure on the land. And over time, here's 1853, we come up, here's 1880, nothing happens, or almost nothing happens. Why? Again, we have to come back to the quality of the soils here. The alpha soils, mollisols, and particularly the mollisols, have a great buffering ability, buffering in the sense of resiliency. High carbon content, good structure. They were deep. They were thought to be inexhaustible. They were not, unfortunately. And using the three-field rotation, which they had brought from Europe, simply was not adequate to sustain them. They began to fail after a while. And when they failed, what we had was termed a threshold event. In other words, it almost nothing happened, and then suddenly everything broke loose. And that began to happen about about the turn of the century. And by 1900, there was almost no relationship. In other words, the land is simply out of control. And the function here is actually going vertical at that point. And it goes up to a very high level. So starting in the late 1930s, in comes various agencies, the governments, the farmers are apprised of the problem, they start changing things, and we see a transition. And then we see a decrease. Now notice that it does not happen immediately. Again, there is a lag. It takes time. Just simply putting the strips there helps, but it takes time for those rotations, those going from a 3-year rotation to a 7-year rotation, a 4-year hay, for example. It takes time for that to take effect. It takes time to get the organic, get the carbon, to get the earthworms, to get the structure back. And so what we see is an improvement, but a lag a function going here. And then through the 40s and into the 50s, continuing decrease, taking it back into the 1970s when we put this together, and more or less flattening out at that point. Now I have two things graphed here. I have valley sedimentation rates, which we actually measured in the valleys. And then I also have the soil erosion rates. This is the dotted line. Now this was calculated from the universal soil loss equation. Now I worked with and knew and respected all the people who developed and furthered the universal soil loss equation, but it has limited utility for this sort of thing. Nevertheless, we've used it here, and you can see that the accumulation of material in the valleys far exceeded the so-called erosion rate from the soil. Now why was that? It's because of the rills and gully erosion occurring on the upland. In other words, we were getting much more than the equations would have predicted from given land use at that time. There was another factor here that I think is extremely important, and that is grazing animals. Now, dairy industry came into this region in the late 1900s. By the way, as I say, I'm working on a book on this now, and I'm putting all this land use together, so it's kind of fresh on my mind. And there was very little control of grazing animals. Cattle were the biggies, but there were a lot of sheep, a lot of horses. Most pigs were kept penned, but not always. I know fields were hogged off and so forth. But we really tend to concentrate on the cattle and sheep here. Pretty much this was uncontrolled grazing. And woodlands were prime areas. Farmers just often just simply turned their animals loose and they were able to range into forest. They did severe damage. They didn't understand this. It was found later that often a cow would actually consume more calories going up and down some of these wooded slopes than she got she got from eating this woody browse. It was not good stuff. And by the 1970s, farmers had learned their lesson. As one old grizzled farmer told me my first year in Coon Creek, he said, "Son, for a cow to make a living in the woods, she has to have a mouth 3 feet wide and move 30 miles an hour." And he had it. So, I mean, they found out. You keep the cows out of the woods. You keep them off these fragile areas, and grazing practices have vastly improved since that time. I think this is a major factor, and I have written several papers on this, including some experiments I have run with cattle on my own farm in Tennessee. Now, let me encapsulate. I want to talk about the watershed in 3 regions. We'll talk about the tributaries, then we'll come down and we'll talk about the middle valley, and then we'll talk about the lower valleys in this region. And to show you what happened, we are here looking at the north branch of the Whitewater River. The photograph was made about early 1900s, probably 1905, let's say. You're looking at the stream right here. We are just about 2 miles west of Elba on a hill. And if you will keep your eye on the road junction and the barn here, that will be in every photo. We're going to see a time sequence. And I want you to look at the stream. You will see it is still bounded by trees. Not all streams were bounded by trees at the time of European settlement, but they later were. Anyway, this indicates stability. What you don't see are the brook trout, probably still swimming in that stream. We're going to move up a mere 35 years to 1940, and that's the same scene. The stream now is 2 to 5 times as wide as it was. It's gravel. It looks like a gravel road from air photographs. I think you will understand that the brook trout are having a pretty hard time in that. Essentially, they're gone. Why is this? It's because the hydrologic response from those fields, we saw this in the soil erosion, the hydrologic response, that is the runoff for a given rainfall amount, has increased so radically after about the turn of the century. Again, with the deterioration of the soil structure and physical condition. That's the first thing. And then along with it, the bed load it was carrying caused the stream to widen out to erode. That is a typical tributary you're looking at in the 1930s, 40s, and even into the early 1950s. All right, 1940. So we come back, and we're there in the summer of 1976, and keep your eye on the barn and the intersection. We are back close to what we looked like in 1912. The stream now is narrowing back to its earlier configuration. You can see the trees have come back in that area. You say, well, what about the fish? Well, at that time, it was still imported German brown trout. But guess what? The brook trout are coming back. Every year, I get reports from the Minnesota and Wisconsin and Iowa fisheries, and the brookies are coming back. Indeed, some of these areas, they tell me now that the fishing industry, they think in time, will actually be worth more than the agriculture. I find that hard to believe, but they think so. It is a tremendous tourist draw now. And just the fish alone, in my view, are a tremendous testimony to what has happened in this region. Those 3 photographs, in my view, tell it better than anything else that I can say. No matter how many graphs and so forth and measurements we make, that tells the story. But I do have more to say. The guy who designed this was Dr. Stafford Happ. He was an incredibly hard-driving guy. I met him when I was in graduate school. I admired the work he had done. He's the one who designed these projects, in fact, all the projects for the USDA around the United States. But he made the photograph right here, I'm sorry, this photograph as a typical tributary in this region at that time, typical. Now you can look at that and make up your mind what the fishing probabilities are, about any aesthetic qualities of it and so forth. It's a pretty grim scene. The same scene, when I appeared, when I started working in 1973, 74, I had his photograph. That's what it looked like. It's gotten progressively better. That stream has narrowed back. These tributaries were typically narrow enough that a person could jump across back in the old days. They were deeper and more narrow. And the brookies they weren't thin, but the brookies are back now. The kind of violence, and I use that word advisedly, in those stream valleys, I mean, you now look at these bucolic scenes, and it's hard to imagine the sort of storms, the sort of changes that were going on. Let me just tell you. Right here, we have the survey on this. I mean, I've got hard survey numbers. In 1938, when this was surveyed, the stream was on this side. Between 1938 and 1974, when we surveyed this, the stream moved all the way across here, cut that bank away, which is modern sediment. Then it moved back all the way across over here, and that's the way we saw it in 1974. Now, to look at this, you would think that that it had been that way since it was made by creation, but it hasn't. It's wonderful testimony to Mother Nature. Those cobbles and gravels you saw are now covered with finer material and are now growing grass. And this is a new floodplain. Here is the old floodplain. Here is the new floodplain. This alone, this morphology, is diagnostic of the new hydrologic regime. In other words, the annual flood is smaller. Any way you put it, the response, the stream flow for any given precipitation event is going to generally be much smaller now than it used to be. There's less water leaving the land. Conversely, since more water is infiltrating, base flow is up. Again, those brookies love it. You need base flow, you need spring flow. It needs to be cold, clean water. They're getting it. Springs are reappearing all over this region that had not, people had forgotten about them in many cases. Where I found homesteads, where people could remember the springs miraculously reappeared. One, incredibly, in 1988, the big drought year that was mentioned earlier today. Okay, we could go on about the tributaries, but let's talk about the Middle Valley for a moment. This is the village of Coon Valley in 1912. We see, like most of these villages, they were built on Pleistocene terraces. You can see the cheese factory up here built. You can see the terrace face right here. The stream bank is about 6 feet high. We know that from photogrammetry. I won't bother you with all the techniques here. The stream bank is 6 feet high. Now again, the height of the stream bank is diagnostic of the hydrologic regime. We look at that same scene in 1976, I think it is. You can't even see any buildings in the background. Same angle. That stream bank now is 13 feet high, where it was only 6 feet in 1912. That 13 feet high stream bank, that floodplain now is that high, tells you that that stream has undergone radical change in that period of time. That's the first thing you see, but there's more. The second thing you see is that that bank is being cut away. And as it's being cut away, what's happening over here is that a lower bank is being built. A 13-foot high bank is being cut away here, and as it migrates, as it retreats, a 6-foot high bank is built. Guess what? That's the same height as 1912. In other words, morphologically, it tells us we are going back to a hydrologic regime that existed at the turn of the century. We are improved. We are essentially reversing history. I think that's great news. And we see it all over. We see it in the tributaries you saw a moment ago. You're seeing it here in the Upper Main Valley. But there's something else here that has to be noted too. If, you know, this is not high science. If you're cutting away a bank that is 13 feet high and you're replacing it with a bank 6 feet high, guess what? A lot of sediment is migrating downstream. In other words, the stream itself is the source of the sediment. So if you've got some governmental agency down there measuring sediment, and they say, whoa, you've got a huge sediment load. Yeah, but where's it coming from? Is it coming from the present farm practices, or is it coming out of this basin? And why is it coming out of the basin? It's coming out of the stream because of conservation practices. There's this incredible, it's cruel irony that the same conservation practices that have curtailed, significantly curtailed the soil erosion have now set this legacy sediment in motion. Sorry, it's just, I didn't make it happen, it's just the way it is. And so you ask, I mean, here's an area that would look to be a great area to be treated. Well, hold on just a minute. Let's look at another area a little bit upstream. And while he's getting that fixed, I'll go ahead. And this is an area that we chose to study very carefully, in part because the farmer who owns this land refused to let Wisconsin DNR let these people get their hands on it, because I knew they would rip-rap it and do all sorts of modifications. Now, I've got nothing against the fish traps or the fish shelters. I published a paper saying those fish shelters actually help stabilize the stream. I'm okay with that. But, you know, let's let streams do what they're going to do if we can live with it. And I think we could here. And anyway, what we see here is this is the historical floodplain. Now, it's about 12 feet high, 11, 12 feet high. This is all modern, this is all historical sediment. It's being cut away, and a new lower floodplain is being built. Again, diagnostic of the new milder hydrologic regime. So the sediment is moving out, and we are getting these new lower floodplains. One upside to this is that the historical floodplains are flooded less, so the farmer gains by that. Now, you would see this and say, whoa, if we get in here and stabilize those stream banks, those high banks, we would do good. Well, hold on just a minute. We made long measurements here, and I am a great fan of making long-term measurements, if you possibly can. And what we found was that the blue areas here, the shaded areas, are modern floodplains where material has been removed. So you can figure, 11 minus 6, or 5 feet or more material removed. What I found was this, that as the high banks retreated and as the low banks advanced, that the amount of material deposited on these low banks balanced out what was being eroded from the high banks. So my question to DNR was, why change all of this? And the answer, as best I can understand, is we have plenty of money and we're going to do it anyway, which they did. This guy's still holding out, but I think he's getting weak. So I'm going to lose this long-term study reach, of which I hate to do. Okay, this is a cross-section at this, and you can see what's happening here. You can see the high bank being cut away and a new floodplain being built. Now, that's a small basin, and you can argue that we have time to do it. I mean, apropos to the Minnesota River, I'm not sure there is time. You could let this evolve over time, and it would create these new floodplains, and it would kind of, you'd get this negative feedback, and it would take care of itself. I'm not sure we can deal with that. Oh, sorry. Okay. So that then is the middle reach. And then we go into the lower valley. And here we see a typical scene, lower valley. The banks are maybe 5 feet high. This stream is still meandering. It is still, we still get channel migration. This channel, in fact, again, we had a survey line here. That channel had moved about 100 feet, has moved about 100 feet across the floodplain in the time that I have been working there. But here's what's different. As it cuts away a bank 5 feet high, it builds a new floodplain 5 feet high. In other words, that whole thing is continuing to a grade. They wanted to put some riprap in there, and I'm saying, well, why? You know, just over a period of time, we'll just bury it, and it'll move on anyway. But they're putting riprap in. But I want to come back, though, to this idea of sediment, historical sediment migrating, this legacy sediment with which we must contend in most basins of the world, and certainly of the eastern United States. How are we going to manage it? What does it portend? Well, it's problematic. And we'll just close out here in a moment. We are at Arcadia, Wisconsin, on the Trimble River. Arcadia and the Trimble now are the recipients of this migrating sediment, now largely sand, moving down the tributaries and moving into the larger streams. And it's pretty much an inexorable process unless you try to stop it. So the river has a grade here. We measured at least 3 feet of aggradation of the Trimble River. I got a call from the village of Arcadia because their basements were getting wetter and wetter. And I said, well, I don't do groundwater. They said, no, we think it relates to this. Well, it did. The master stream is aggrading. The tributaries that come in from either side are aggrading. So it's raising the groundwater all around the village. And yes, their basements are getting wetter and wetter. In fact, they have large pumps to pump groundwater out of the village right now. And what do? Well, it's very difficult. Pumping sand out is one thing they've tried. But in a sense, this is a region trapped in its own history. And many other regions find themselves in this situation. Let me just give you a couple of footnotes here. The question of vegetation came up, and I will just tell you one thing we found here. In the lower reaches of these valleys, where the banks were low, we found that grass actually was a far better stabilizer than trees. Here, for example, is a grassed reach, and here is the worst, I must say. That was the best of the grass reach. Here is the worst of the timbered reaches. But what was happening, and there are many complexities to this, but what was happening is that much of this woody debris was accumulating in the channels and was, during high events, creating erosion and causing the stream channels to erode. We do not claim this to be a universal model, but we think it's applicable to these lower reaches of valleys. And it does seem that at the time of European settlement, many of these valleys were, that is, the floodplains were largely grass covered. I think I've used up my time, so I'll call it. Thank you very much.
We have about 4 minutes for questions. Question there.
Yes, sir.
The improvements in the upper reaches, were they accomplished by regulation or cooperation?
Cooperation. They used a lot of techniques. Most farmers went for the rotations fine. They did not like contour strips. They call it crazy quilt farming. So what they did, they meaning largely governmental agencies, they created conservation demonstration areas, and Coon Creek was one of those. And they heavily subsidized the installation of contour strips as well as all the other practices, and then brought people in from the adjacent areas to see those. And once they saw them working, once they saw the value of this, you could just see over time, and this diagram is in professional paper 1, 2, 3, 4, where you see the the installation in Coon Creek, and then you, over time, the next 40 years, you see the dissemination into the adjacent countryside. Now there is no difference between Coon Creek and the others. But it was done by a combination. I don't think at that time there was actually any commandments or forbidding. It was mainly subsidy, encouragement, and appealing to the self-interest of landowners.
Question over there.
Yeah, I agree with that. I just want to add on, we farmed just one hill north of Whitewater, so there's just two other things that were important. And the drop structures on some of the steep ravines, there were some major head cuts, and with drop structures, they would have cut that off. Terraces, and then a lot of ponds for cattle, and all of these together during the 50s, 60s, early 70s really cut down on the load.
Structures did play some part, and part of these were, and of course in 55 minutes I couldn't cover every point, but they did a lot of gully control structures that were extremely important. This one gully I showed you healed without any structures, but particularly CCC was very important, and later SCS, and installing structures and gullies and curtailing this, yes.
I realize that this is a different landscape here in south central Minnesota, but do you have any comments on whether the streams in this area are in a state of unraveling or healing or neither?
Well, I just a really gut reaction after a full 4 hours field trip here is that what we're seeing is a period of disequilibrium brought on by a multitude of factors, including what appears to be greatly increased precipitation.
Final question to Representative Paul Torkelson.
Thank you. Are you familiar with, and would you care to comment on the sedimentation of Lake Pepin?
No, I would not. I do not know enough about. All I would say is that I would urge you to go back to the earliest historical records you can and reconstruct those carefully, because I think they're very instructive. Just this morning I ran into an indication that there was sediment flowing in there certainly in the late 1800s.
And that's a great lead-in for what I think will be part of the next presentation. So thank you very much for a great presentation.